Hi, Motheo. It's Siva here. My mom is about to retire. She's talking about using her lump sum to clear debt, take a big overseas trip, and maybe even buy a new car. She says it's her time to live, but I'm worried she's rushing into big decisions and taking advice from her friends instead of professionals. How can I help her make better choices and make sure she's covered for the future?
Welcome to today's episode. Siva, that's a powerful and emotional question, one that hits close to home for many families in South Africa. Retirement isn't just about reaching a certain age, it's about the choices you make when you get there and how those choices shape the rest of your life. Welcome to Everything Counts. In this bi-weekly podcast series, we're frank about money and the discussions we should all be having: how to save it, how to spend it, how to grow it, its pitfalls, and how to make it work for us. On Everything Counts, we share the information you need to get your financial ducks in a row. My name is Motheo Khoaripe, host of Everything Counts. Joining me are Kate Robson, co-head of Investec My Investments, and Johan Loubser, who's the head of Adviser Enablement at Investec. You two have been here quite a few times. You are the experts we rely on such topics, and we're going to be talking retirement and how to use your money post-retirement. Welcome again to Everything Counts.
Thanks, Motheo.
Thanks, Motheo. Great to be back.
Kate, let's then talk about when retirement happens. You've saved up all this money, you've been waiting for it, and you're getting all sorts of advice, and you have your own ideas about what you want to do with the money. How critical is it not to change the way you have your money behaviors at this point?
So I think the first thing is, for a lot of us, we are very focused on getting to 55 or 60, 65 when we're going to retire, and everything that we do is around, am I going to have enough? I think what people often forget is that when retirement does come, your savings principles and saving philosophies don't necessarily stop. So I think a lot of us are focused on just getting to that number, getting to that age. And I think often what happens is that we don't really think about what happens beyond that. And today I suppose we really want to speak a little bit about what are the core principles that you need to apply once you do reach that retirement age. Your earnings might stop and your income might stop, but certainly your financial decisions don't.
But Kate, come on, you're retiring. This feels like a bonus. Almost rewarding yourself for all the years you've been so disciplined. We can get carried away at some point.
Yeah, definitely. I think that certainly I've got this fantasy around getting to 55, stopping working, maybe going on an overseas trip. But again, I think it is imperative that we're realistic around how long we're going to live for, what decisions that we need to make at the age of retirement so that we can obviously live out our retirement years financially independent.
I think the scary thing for me is thinking when you get to retirement that the next 20, 30 years are just on you and the decisions that you've made. I think that's what sobers me up a little bit. But it's a lot to think about, that 20 to 30 years that you have to sustain yourself financially.
Motheo, that's a great point. So we spend a big portion of your working career saving for retirement, 35, 40 years, and that needs to sustain you for the next 30 years. So I think that is quite a big concept to get used to when you're saving for retirement up until the point where you do get there. And Kate mentioned it earlier, your employment income stops, but your expenses doesn't. And according to Alexander Forbes, the average South African can only replace about 31% of their income with retirement savings.
Sure.
So if we think of that, if you are buying one coffee a week now, you can only buy one coffee every 3 to 4 weeks. And that's the impact if you don't have enough retirement savings. So that shortfall shows us why preserving capital and maintaining growth is so important. And then when you do get to retirement, there's a lot of things to unpack. So it is the longevity question, making sure that your income can last for 20 to 30 years. But it's also, where am I going to get my income from? Do I have enough liquidity? Where I'm going to access money if I need it in the form of a lump sum? Because retirement products or post-retirement products can be quite limited in how you can access them. So that balance between access to funds and retirement savings is quite important.
You often hear people have different wish lists when they retire. They want to pay off their debt or refurbish their home and do all sorts of things now that they have this magical lump sum. But how careful should they be when the time comes where that money goes?
So I think it speaks to my earlier point around having sufficient liquidity. So when you do get to retirement, you do have this big pot of money and you've got access to some of your retirement savings. But the decision then comes in, do I use this to settle all of my debt? Do I have any debt at retirement? And if I do that, what will be left from a liquidity perspective? Because you don't stop living when you get to retirement. You do still want to enjoy your retirement years. You've spent a lot of time working for them. So you do want to save up funds for that holiday, for when there's sports tours for your grandkids. You do want to be able to attend them, and you need liquidity for that. So I think planning for those things in your retirement expenses, if I can call it that, is quite important.
Let's rewind then a little bit for those who are not yet retired. The few years out from retirement, there are tools that you can still use to try and shore up that capital you're talking about, get a bit of zeros next to that figure at retirement. So what are those things that you still can do to try and raise the money to make sure it's enough for when you retire?
We've spoken about this in previous episodes, is, the importance of engaging a financial advisor around what does that retirement plan look like. Everybody is relatively worried about not having enough, but important to sit down with somebody and really putting a plan together to make the best use of both your tax-efficient investments, some of what we call your discretionary investments that don't fall within sort of your retirement savings or tax-free investments, but are really important to be able to create liquidity, as Johan mentioned, in addition to the retirement savings vehicles. And then I think really importantly, even once you retire, again, it's a really critical life stage for you to sit down and engage an advisor again around those 20 to 30 years that you may not necessarily be saving as much as previously, but where you need to balance savings as well as spending.
A lot of people get big brains trusts around retirement, whether it's family or an uncle who's been retired for 20 years. But how important is it to go sit with a professional and actually have a plan that's unique to you and your needs?
For me, it's really key that you connect with your advisor, that you see them as a trusted advisor. Often a friend or family member, that person at the braai, may not necessarily have all of the information at hand. And also, I think it's critical, we spoke earlier around if you were to go and see a GP, you would go and see a medical specialist if something was wrong with your heart. And again, this is really around a relationship with a financial specialist that is going to get you through your years, which are really important to you and what you've worked incredibly hard for.
Johan, when it comes to that advisor, are they going to treat you differently now that you're retired, or are they still going to work through a plan that they had been working with you when you were getting maybe a salary or maybe through your business?
I think the relationship does change slightly because both the objectives for you as the client and the advisor now changes, because you move from accumulating funds to reach a certain goal to now decumulating. And something that's very important in that is the longevity of the fund. So making sure that what you are taking from your investment is sustainable over that 20 to 30 year period. So with that in mind, I think you need to align with your financial advisor. They need to understand your goals, your objectives. We spoke around school tours for the grandkids, holidays, new cars, whatever it might be in retirement. And it's important to have an open conversation with your advisor and get to a point where you both know what's going to happen in retirement, also what is feasible and what is not. And I think that's where the connection and the alignment comes in, because the research does show that advised clients feel less stress and have greater peace of mind. And if we think of the example earlier, you don't want there to be any uncomfortability when you go to the braai and your uncle has given you bad advice. You want to enjoy your retirement years. You want to speak to someone that deals with these things every day, because the landscape does change quite a lot over time. If we think back 20 to 30 years from now, something like Regulation 28 wasn't in place, but it is at the moment. So someone that deals with these things on a daily basis, that understands your needs, your goals, your objectives, would probably be someone that could guide you on that journey.
Can you remind us what that regulation means?
So Regulation 28 is something that governs pre-retirement funds, and it governs them in what you are allowed to invest in. What is the maximum exposure to equity? What is the maximum exposure to offshore? And those dictate how much a fund manager can actually invest in those different asset classes. The point that I was making around the shifting landscape is Regulation 28 is a good example. This was actually first introduced in 1962. However, major revisions of the regulation came into effect in 2011 and then again in 2022. So the landscape does change, and it is important to stay up to date with that, to have a financial advisor that can guide you and make sure that you are compliant with these regulations.
And that's why it's always great to have a good advisor. But what makes a good one? Because someone will tell you that, look, these things can be a hit and miss, but when do you know that you've got the right man and woman for the job?
I think being a financial advisor is a lot more than the person in front of you. It's also got to do with what happens in the back end. And I think when you are engaging with potential financial advisors, your existing financial advisors, it's important to understand the processes of how they got to what they are recommending to you. Ideally, you don't want a one-man band that's coming to you and presenting what they think is best, a robust process through the firm or the company that they're working with, backed by research and expertise that's not only limited to one person. I think those are the sort of questions that one needs to ask to understand what you're putting in front of me, how did that come about, and am I comfortable with that? Does that make sense to me?
Kate, a lot of people struggle with the honesty and transparency of sitting in front of a financial advisor because this is somebody looking at your money, something that people can be quite conservative about. But how important is it to have that trust and relationship with an advisor?
I think it's really important to choose a firm or an organization where, from a regulatory perspective, they're regulated. There's understanding of their processes and procedures. We often talk about the internal process that we've got in order to help our advisors deliver a view to clients, and there's many people that are part of that process. Then I think often, and we see it a lot, clients will only give a certain amount of information until they feel that they can trust you and that they've built a level of rapport and connection. But again, often from a financial advisory perspective, is once you've got to that point with an advisor, it is incumbent to share as much as you can. Because ultimately, if you don't share, the advisor's only got a view of what you have shared. And sometimes that advice can then be constrained with regards to the information that they've got at hand. So they may be giving you a view because they don't know what your debt is. And that retirement plan may then solve for a certain need based on the information that they've got at hand.
And can you get a second opinion like you would with the doctor?
Definitely.
If you don't feel you don't have the right person?
Definitely. And look, I don't think from a shopping around perspective that might not necessarily work out, but certainly looking at it, asking questions, making sure that you're not just being sold a particular product, understanding the process behind that advice, how did that advisor get to that point? These are really important questions that I think anybody should be asking their advisor. And then I think maybe just something else to consider is, Johan referenced a study earlier, but that study the study that Johan referenced also found that most people with a financial advisor feel calmer, more in control, and save hours each week by not managing everything alone. So I think often, even those of us that work in banking, we still would reach out to a financial advisor. Often our own perception of what we're doing versus that of an objective party, fresh eyes, is really important. Yeah, and I think if anything, the real value of an advisor is somebody that simplifies your financial life so that you can effectively focus on living it. But again, if I had to think about three things that I would look for in an advisor, it would be objectivity, somebody that's not trying to just sell a product, somebody that I can trust, and then somebody that's got a team of people behind them with a robust process.
So when it comes to the timing around getting the advice, it should necessarily be before you get the lump sums and the money, right?
The quick answer is as early as possible, because your pre-retirement planning and advice will lead to what your options are at retirement. But if we focus specifically around the event of retiring and now starting to draw an income from your portfolio, that's something that probably needs to happen a couple of years before you actually pull the trigger. And the reason for that being is to understand, where are my funds currently sitting and where am I going to get the income from that I need, as well as any lump sums, any liquidity that I might need at retirement. And that also gives you leeway that if you need to adjust slightly 5 to 7 years before retirement, you can do that.
I think Johan's referring to something we call, from an investment principle, is the time horizon of your investments. We spoke in earlier podcasts around exposing your assets or your underlying portfolio to high growth assets. Mm-hmm. And certainly 5 to 7 years before you're going to retire, you don't necessarily want your assets exposed to something that could potentially impacted negatively. An equity market movement or currency changes, geopolitical risk, etc. And that's why it's really important that when you're thinking about retirement, that you're engaging somebody around the next life phase.
So when it comes to the point where you do retire, does your behavior change as an investor? Do you become more conservative, or can you still continue being a risk finder and looking for things that are high growth?
Yes, it does change slightly because ultimately you don't stop investing at retirement. But when you do get to decumulation, you are going to need access to some of your funds in the form of income, in the form of lump sums. So that portion of your portfolio, you do probably want to de-risk a little bit. But the funds that you're only going to access in 10 to 15 years from now, you don't need to de-risk that immediately because they're going to remain invested for that period.
Coming up, we'll talk about the often overlooked risks of health and travel in retirement and why having the right cover could mean the difference between comfort and crisis. Stay with us.
Markets move fast, headlines change even faster. You need more than news, you need insight. Join me, Jeremy Maggs, on Investec's flagship podcast, No Ordinary Wednesday. Every second Wednesday, Investec experts unpack South Africa's biggest economic, business and political conversations and what they mean for you and your business. No Ordinary Wednesday, where information meets insight.
Every financial journey has its twists and turns. The question is, who's walking it with you? At Investec, we know that the right partner doesn't just guide you, but helps you see opportunities others might miss. Whether you're considering offshore retirement investing or planning your next big move, we're here to help you take each step with confidence.
Welcome back to Everything Counts. Let's talk health and protection now at retirement. Kate, Siva's mom, sounding like a person who has a lot of plans. They want to travel, get new experiences, but health is always a big factor around this time, right? As you get older. How should that reality shape retirement planning?
Yeah, so I think often we always think about all the amazing things that we're going to do after we retire. But again, I think there is a reality around as we retire, we get older. From a lifestyle point of view, we've got to think about health and longevity risks. As a woman, I know I'm going to probably live longer than my husband, and women are typically living longer. I might have to think about retiring or having income for 40 years versus 30 years. Obviously, medical costs, your medical aid significantly increases the older that you get. Those obviously rise faster than inflation. And then there's things like critical illness, medical cover. A lot of people that retire potentially will be diagnosed with some form of cancer. And I think importantly, you don't necessarily want to dip into your, for lack of a better word, your longevity savings in order to cover medical costs. So ensuring that all of your cover is in place as well as your savings. And I think we go back to the piece from a financial advisory perspective is that this is another phase of your investment journey, of your financial plan, and really critical that you take that planning both from a risk cover perspective as well as a savings perspective into retirement.
Kate, and you make a really good point. So we spoke around de-risking your investment portfolio, retirement planning earlier, but I think when it gets to retirement, there's other ways that you can de-risk yourself as an individual in retirement. And those are things like gap cover, making sure you're on the appropriate medical aid. If you're traveling, making sure you've got sufficient travel insurance. Because what you don't want is a single medical event wiping out your savings or your discretionary funds where you've got access to them that was intended for future use for other things that you do want to do in retirement.
So you're basically buffering all the money you have in that basket to say, instead of dipping into this, let me make sure that I've got cover elsewhere, whether it's medical or travel. Should anything happen, I don't have to touch the money that I'm using for the rest of my retirement.
Yes, that's correct. So I think the message that we want to take out of this is it's not only your investment planning where you should consider risk, it's also in your personal life and your day-to-day in your retirement.
If you were somebody that was covering an entire family and now you retire, do you also take them on in the medical plan as well? Are they still on your medical aid, or do you have to change the way you do things because the money is not as big as it used to?
So Motheo, I think that's one of the other key principles from a retirement point of view, which I think we often don't think about, is that for many people, up until the age that you retire, you are supporting potentially a spouse, family, children. And, when you get to retirement, obviously from an income point of view, that potentially may need to come to an end. A colleague of ours, Kate Stannard, wrote a beautiful article called Putting on Your Own Oxygen Mask First. When you're in the aeroplane, they always tell you to put your own oxygen mask on first. And the principle there is that you need to ensure that you are able to take care of yourself before taking care of others. And I think it is something that is really important to discuss both with your family members as well as with your advisor. Is if you have been a breadwinner or you have been supporting a large family, is that when retirement does come about, how do you ensure that you don't deplete all of your retirement savings and then 10, 15 years' time, there's nothing left for yourself?
And I think it's very natural to want to help your family members. It comes from a good place, but we need to plan for it. So in South Africa, there's many concepts, things like black tax. That's part of who we are as South Africans, and that being financial support. So ultimately, it's not wrong, but it does need to be planned for, because generational wealth could look very different. It could be you leaving money to family when you're no longer there, or it could be supporting them while you are still alive. But in order for you to do that in a sustainable way, I think you do need to plan for that. It needs to be part of your expenses. And it's not something that only happens at retirement. You need to plan for that pre-retirement, because you know it is going to come up.
I think that speaks to the next topic I want to talk about, which is a money behavior called being impulsive. You're getting all this money, you know you're going to get all this money, but there's people also around you that are making plans for that money. I know with my dad, when we knew he was retiring, we're all like, oh, okay, we're going to get something from this. And he's a very frugal guy. He doesn't like to spend. He's very patient with his money, can live below his means. But with my mom and us wanting stuff to spend on, I think we dented him a little bit and became impulsive. So how can you make sure that you control that, to not say that you've now got money that is never ending?
Well, so I think we spoke about it earlier, just with regards to trusting that objective financial advisor. And I think, again, it is a really useful relationship to engage with around what do you need, what does your family need, what do your family want, and trying to differentiate between needs and wants. And I think that it's a really important process, if your family is willing, is to use that opportunity or that engagement with that advisor to really educate the family around what is required for your retirement, so that, one, you don't become dependent on your children, and two, that, from an impulsivity perspective, is that short-term gain may create quite long-term pain. Sorry, that sounds quite ominous, but I think it's really important to understand what you do in the short term and the impact long term.
And can your financial advisor help you set those boundaries, even legally, to say this portion of money can only be used after this particular period?
I think from an estate planning perspective, look, a lot of financial advisors, fiduciary specialists can certainly assist around your will, your letter of wishes, for example, and can certainly help you from a decision-making perspective. Let's say that by the time I'm 95, I may want to give somebody power of attorney over my affairs to make sure that while I'm in sort of frail care, maybe not able to make decisions, that at least there is a legal construct in place to assist with those types of
there are also some strategies in place that are deliberately there to protect people from themselves, if you will, in terms of becoming impulsive. What percentage can you get in bulk, and what percentage are you allowed to then get every month?
I guess the answer to that question depends on how you saved for retirement. So typically, a retirement savings such as pension funds, retirement annuities, preservation funds, when you go into retirement and start drawing an income from them, can be restricted in terms of what you can access. Voluntary funds, things like unit trusts, tax-free savings, are more open-ended and you've got more liquidity in them. But I think to answer your question in a slightly different way, well, in two ways, is that yes, there are mechanisms within your investment portfolio that restricts access and builds a bit of discipline, but you also require self-discipline, and that needs to be communicated to your family, your spouse, and your financial advisor, who will then hold you accountable for that. They will never tell you, no, you're not allowed to take this. But a bit of accountability sometimes helps to pick up the mirror and say, do I actually need these funds now? And that will probably benefit you in the long term.
I think let's look at some of the gems as well when we talk about advice when you retire. You spoke about something quite interesting, Kate, where you were saying you're likely going to live longer than your husband, and you have to consider that as a woman. So just some of those things that you could still share with our listeners in terms of what they need to still consider when they do retire.
Some of the things that I think about from a replacement point of view is what ratio am I going to replace at? Johan mentioned that average replacement percentage in South Africa is about 31%. We know that we need to be closer to 75% to be comfortable from a retirement point of view. I think the other thing that I really do consider and worries me a little bit is, where am I going to live? Retirement homes can be quite expensive.
Yeah.
Retirement care can be expensive. If you are living longer than your spouse, potentially longer than your children, who's going to care for you? Where are you going to be? Is it going to be adequate? I think that's a real worry. And then I think the other thing for me is, what do I need to be doing now so that I can get as close to that 75% as possible? And then I think the last thing is probably that we have seen through research the value of advice, the real value that it creates from being invested in the right things and having the right risk cover in place, and then also making sure that you are doing enough. In addition to those points, the one other thing that we often overlook is around starting early from a retirement point of view and being consistent. So often people don't save, or they are overwhelmed by the amount that they need to save and therefore don't do anything. And I think the point is to try and get as close to that 75% as possible. The really important takeaway is to start early and then to stay consistent over the years that you've got left.
I think to add on to my previous point is that retirement isn't a full stop. So investing doesn't stop there, planning doesn't stop there. We spoke about it today that retirement is a lot broader than only what your investment portfolio looks like. So what that means is that in retirement you still need to make these decisions. You still need to consult with your financial advisor, your fiduciary specialist. And then lastly, I think stay invested and stay informed. Things change. 20 to 30 years is a long time. You want to make the best out of those years, but you also want to stay informed, and your plan needs to evolve with any changes that happen.
And of course, you can still earn money through investing after retirement. It doesn't have to stop.
Correct. When you get to retirement, it doesn't mean that you now have to completely stop. That business venture or side hustle that you've always dreamt about or wanted to start but didn't have the time, you could probably do that. If you've got enough money for retirement, it doesn't mean that you have to stop earning an income.
All right, that was Kate Robson, co-head of Investec My Investments, and Johan Loubser, the head of Adviser Enablement at Investec, talking to us about how you should be behaving when you retire and things to consider. So if you are someone close to entering retirement, remember, it's not about the date on the calendar. It's about the decisions you make once you're there. Find a financial advisor who understands you, get the right protection, and take your time before making big financial moves, because at this stage, every decision counts. Kate and Johan, thank you so much again for joining us. You've been listening to Everything Counts, brought to you by Investec. My name is Motheo Khoaripe. Join us next time as we explore more ways to make your money and your choices count.
The views expressed are those of the contributors at the time of publication and do not necessarily represent the views of the firm and should not be taken as advice or recommendations. Investec Private Banking, a division of Investec Bank Limited, a registered credit provider committed to the Code of Banking Practice as regulated by the Ombudsman for Banking Services.